My next guest on the show grew up idolizing all things flight. That was until he was 14 years old, and he says that his eyes were opened and he realized that the moon landing was actually a host. Mark Sibrel has worked for every major news organization you can think of: ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, TLC, USA. He's done work for them, and he's done award-winning work. Bart wrote a book called Moon Man, and I would say that a third of that book is dedicated towards evidence of disproving the moon landing. A third of that book is dedicated towards his tales of espionage and how he was kidnapped by the CIA. And a third of that book is condemning the US government and how each of these, if you want to call them conspiracy theories, although he would probably call himself a corruption theorist, how all these theories of corruption are interconnected.
Quite frankly, it's kind of unusual.
It's quite Franklin.
Got it. Quite Franklin.
Didn't know, Bart, that you're actually from Dayton, Ohio. You're born at Wright-Patterson.
Yep, I was.
Talk to me about that, because obviously your birthplace is going to somewhat, in my opinion, predetermine your interest in the subject at hand today.
Well, it's interesting. I do mention that in the book Moon Man, that myself and Neil Armstrong and the Wright brothers are all from the same town of Dayton, Ohio. Yeah, my dad was in the Air Force, and he was, at the time I was born, stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And he was an officer in the Air Force. He did some secretive things over the years and some conspiratorial things over the years, I'm sure you could say. So I was very familiar with the aerospace industry, with aircraft and things like that, and grew up as the biggest fan of the moon missions. I remember being 4 years old, and I was asleep at the time they allegedly walked on the moon. Nevertheless, afterwards, because my father was an officer, he got like a VIP package of these 9x12 color pictures from Apollo 11, about 20 of them. So he gave them to me as a gift. I put them up on my bedroom wall, and I saw those pictures every day for 10 years in a row. That's what, 3,650 times, and thought it was the greatest thing. And then when I saw Bill Casing on television when I was 14, he's a gentleman who worked for Rocketdyne, which is a contractor for Apollo. He worked there for 6 years developing the Apollo program, and he was a technical writer, and he had very high security clearances because he would proof confidential memos going from generals to various people in the Pentagon, back to NASA and all the contractors, to kind of correct their grammar, make them look a little bit more educated than they really were. And he saw a memo from von Braun to address to somebody at the Pentagon, who said the likelihood of going to the moon successfully on the first attempt with 1960s technology, he put at 1 in 10,000.
How old were you when you heard this from Bill Casing? You were still a young kid.
Yeah, I was 14 years old, and that kind of planted a seed in my mind. So I went back to my bedroom wall with the pictures on it, and sure enough, it's like it was hidden in plain sight, or my eyes were wide closed, and I began to see, at least in the early prints, they've corrected them since then, but in the early prints, the soil was a very kind of caramel brown, and the background of the alleged mountains, which were actually projections, was kind of a gray blue. They, a few years later, corrected that. They put a blue filter over them and rephotographed them, and now the sand is blue of the soil, and then the background's blue, so they match. But in the ones I had, there was a very distinct line where the fake backdrops began, but I never noticed it before. And then even in that famous picture, allegedly, of Aldrin on the moon with his arm bent, there's a lot of inconsistencies in that. The primary one that people just overlook is that there's wrinkles all in his spacesuit. Now, you have to ask yourself, how many wrinkles are in a balloon? There aren't any, because the thing's inflated. So the fact that there's all these wrinkles in there proves it's not even compressed with air. It's a representation of it. And so that kind of planted the seed And 10 years later, I had become a filmmaker. I started out as an actor and then a playwright and then became a filmmaker. And I was editing one day a project for the gentleman who had produced that television show I'd seen 10 years earlier as a 14-year-old with Bill Casey on it. So I asked him, I said, hey, remember that guy in your show who said we didn't go to the moon? What's his name? He said, I don't remember, but call the San Francisco production office. So I did. And they said, had I called a day or two later, I would have never been able to find out who he was because they were deleting all 10-year-old material to make room for newer projects. So I called up Bill and we started talking, becoming friends. And that's when he first suggested, as a filmmaker, that I do a film about the fake moon landing. So I basically paid myself a salary for 6 months to do some preliminary research and found out that two of the three astronauts on the first, important mission never give interviews, which I thought was kind of odd. And then the Soviets, I didn't realize this, for every 100 hours we spent in space, they spent 500 hours.
Yeah, at this point in time. And we all know that corruption exists at the smallest and highest levels. Take us back to Apollo 1. Take us back to the space race. Take us back to establish the motive as to why the United States would be willing to fake an entire moon landing.
Well, Kennedy was president at the time. And when Alan Shepard went up and went from coast to coast, and I think he was in space for about 15 minutes. He didn't even make a single orbit of the Earth. And this was after the Soviets had already orbited the Earth completely. Not only were we second, we did a fraction of what they did. The Soviets had also launched, as you know, the first satellite, the first animal, the first man, the first woman, the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, the first of 2 spacecraft simultaneously. And like I said, for every 100 hours that we spent in space, they spent 500 hours. They were very much more advanced than we were. Now, Kennedy is a politician, not a scientist. So, as you saw recently, our current president pulled out of Afghanistan without even informing the other nations who had troops there. You would think he would make that call, right? And Kennedy kind of made the same mistake. He just, without consulting his scientists, made this boast. Hey, we sent a guy up into space for 15 minutes. Why don't we try to go to the moon by the end of the decade? And the scientists, after he said that, are like, I think that's pushing reasonable accommodation here. And as of course, they can't go to the moon today. So how could they possibly go on the first attempt with 1/1,000,000th the computing power of a cell phone? All that to say, Kennedy used this analogy. He was Irish, and he said there were these two boys, brothers, who wanted to challenge each other as they were off running around playing. And there was this big wall. And so one brother took the hat of the other brother and threw it over the wall. And he says, now you're forced to achieve this objective, to climb the wall. And he said, by boasting before the entire world that they would go to the moon by the end of the decade, basically he felt would force us, to make it happen. And in fact, it was that boast that was the reason for the falsification, among other reasons. It was basically pride. As you know, the Bible says pride comes before a fall. And it's also the reason why people can't see the faked moon landing. I mean, I could show you one photograph that is and all the evidence you need that proves the fraud. However, there's simple logic. What they're claiming is that they went with 1960s technology that had 1/1,000,000th the computing power of a cell phone in all of NASA, that they went 1,000 times farther than NASA can go today with 5 decades more technology. I mean, for the first time in history, technology has gone backwards, which of course is impossible, which means the moon landings are fake.
To play the devil's advocate here, can NASA not go to the moon, or do they just choose to not go to the moon?
No, they can't, because they keep saying, they've said 10 times since 1969 that they would, quote, return to the moon in 5 years. And they've missed all of the 10 deadlines. In fact, they said, I think in 2017, that by 2019, they would have the Orion spacecraft orbiting the moon. They can't even do that. And then they said, we're going to be on the moon by 2024. And now they're saying they can't do that because the spacesuit doesn't work. The whole thing is bizarre. They admit they deliberately destroyed all of the moon technology, not only the hardware, they destroyed all the blueprints and all the electrical schematics. They destroyed them. Now, think about this. Let's just say Bill Gates built the first big computer. Okay. Now, the cost of going to the moon in today's dollars is $200 billion. Let's just say Bill Gates spent $200 billion building the big computer. It works. It's fantastic. It does what it does. Then he takes all of the designs and all of the hardware and throws them into a furnace and burns them up. Would anyone do that? Of course not. In fact, the B-52 was designed 70 years ago, and there's still 200 of them flying today for the United States Air Force. So the fact that they destroyed the moon hardware and the blueprints is actually proof of the fraud. Because if you really went to the moon, you would never destroy $200 billion worth of investment that you could use today to go to the moon. The fact that they did destroy it is proof that they're covering up the falsehood, because it could be proven technically that the rocket didn't have enough fuel to leave Earth orbit. The lunar module didn't have the capability to provide air conditioning on a bunch of car batteries, and that the computers were not fast enough to synchronize 0 miles per hour, leaving the moon, to 3,000 miles per hour orbiting in the command module, which if they missed by a tenth of a second, the crew would die. If there was any technology ever invented that you wanted to destroy, might be the atomic bomb. But did they destroy that? No. And within 10 years, atomic bombs were 100 times more powerful. This is the claim they're making. Okay, let's just say Toyota in 1969 claimed that they built a car that could go 50,000 miles on 1 gallon of gasoline. And yet today, their best car can only go 50 miles per gallon on a gallon of gasoline, or 1,000th the distance. If that was their claim, would you believe that they had a car 1,000 times better than they did today 50 years ago? Of course not. And that's what they're saying. NASA admits the farthest that they can send an astronaut is 250 miles above the Earth. And yet, which is 1,000th as far as they claim to have sent an astronaut 50 years ago with 50 years older technology. That's completely illogical. That alone proves they didn't go to the moon.
So they destroyed the technology from all the space missions that went to the moon, not just the Apollo 11 space mission, but every single one of them.
And not only did they destroy the equipment and the blueprints and the electronic schematics, they destroyed all the telemetry data that could prove where the spacecraft actually was. They destroyed that. And they destroyed all the original videotapes, because there was an IMAX film that wanted to project them at something like 6-8 times higher quality than they had ever been seen before. And right before they were to do that, they all mysteriously disappeared from the National Archives. Now, they have a copy of the Declaration of Independence that's over 240 years old in the same building, and yet somehow things that were like 30, 40 years old and weighed about 2 tons worth of material somehow mysteriously disappeared. Why would all that stuff disappear unless there was a cover-up, and that would prove it?
If this was a conspiracy, how many people would have to have been on the inside of this conspiracy to cover this up? Like all the scientists that were monitoring the flight in space, that were at NASA that day, even video editors, all these different people. Like, how many people would have to be on the inside of this thing, and it's never leaked?
That's the argument that diehard fans who claim the moon landings are real that they try to throw that out, but it's pretty straightforward. The atomic bomb had 145,000 people involved in it, but only about 8 knew what was actually going on, what they were building. It's through departmentalization. Do you really think the CIA is so stupid to tell the guy making the glove or the boot or the door handle, hey, by the way, we're really not going to the moon? Be sure not to tell anybody. The fact is, there were only 3 eyewitnesses to every flight, and they, of course, were government employees. And there was no independent press coverage whatsoever. Whatever pictures and video that they claimed was coming from the moon came from our federal government, which, as you know, is completely corrupt. And most investigators believe, including Robert Kennedy Jr., that the CIA killed President Kennedy. John McNamara admitted that the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which led to the death of over 1 million people, was completely contrived and made up. And of course, Building 7 of 9/11 proves that something other than an airplane was going on here, demolition or something, we don't know. We have 3,000 engineers who say those buildings, it's scientifically impossible for them to come down from kerosene fires from aircraft. And yet nothing is ever done about it. If they're willing to kill millions of people, right, I think they're willing to fake a TV picture.
Well, I'm still wondering about all the scientists and engineers that were in NASA that day actually tracking the trajectory of the Apollo 11. Like at some point in time, everybody would have had to know.
Well, actually, that's not the case. And the book talks about this. The Soviet Union had done the same thing. They launched an unmanned satellite to orbit the moon, and they transmitted voice to that spacecraft. And then from there, it was retransmitted back to Earth to make it appear that there were men on the spacecraft when there weren't. If you see the very beginning of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, there's a shot, a dolly shot going past all the ground controllers there at NASA before they go to the moon for the very first time, and like 10 seconds before they go, and they're all just kicked back watching television like everybody else. Gene Kranz, the flight director, and other computer operators said, we can tell no difference between a real flight and a simulation. In fact, they launched something called the Tetra A satellite to simulate transmissions coming from the moon so that they could, quote, rehearse the moon landings. Now, they claimed it crashed into the ocean. I believe that's a lie, so that it would still be up there faking the direction of the signals to make them believe that they were coming from the moon when they really weren't. Very few people knew. And of course, in the book that we have an eyewitness who was there at the time who described what he saw on his deathbed because he had been carrying that guilt around for the most of his life.
How would the events of that day unfold when the rocket launches and all the engineers that are sitting inside NASA are watching this and they're reading the data from the trajectory? Where are the actual astronauts? I'm assuming that they're in the rocket as well because of, and we'll get into the video later, but the video that they show of Earth from space while they're in low orbit. But then how did they shoot all the footage of them actually on the moon? Because people would have been kind of tracking this in real time. So was that then proposed to be shot in a separate studio, timed properly? And then who would those people have been? Because you can't see anybody's faces on the moon at that point in time because they're all wearing their shield protectors. Or how would those events have unfolded?
Well, I mean, for example, as you know, CNN during the Iraq War had a guy wearing a flat jacket and a helmet and claimed bombs were falling around him. And then the green screen was exposed. The guy's in Atlanta, Georgia, faking the whole thing. And for some reason, the FCC lets them still operate. It's kind of funny. They were very, very easy to kind of fake this type of thing. In fact, Clinton, former President Clinton, in his book, My Life, on page 156, basically says that he also doubts the authenticity of the moon missions because of television manipulation. We know from a source who was there, he was at the military base where Apollo 11 was filmed 1 year beforehand. He stood beside President Johnson holding television cables, and he was chief of security at this military base. He eyewitnessed them filming it 1 year in advance. So it's my opinion that when they were allegedly walking on the moon and during some of the flight time, they were doing audio live with an earpiece in so that they could kind of improvise things as they went along. The people who were allegedly walking on the moon, it looks like that was pre-recorded and then synchronized. We know from a unidentified classified reel that I got that there's a third track of audio. According to NASA, this is a public event. There's only two people on this radio, signal, NASA and the astronauts. But in fact, there was a third party prompting the astronauts how to fake photography and what to say. We have that on this tape, which at the beginning of it, it says very clearly, do not show to the public. And it's an unedited reel. And we show clearly that they are faking being halfway to the moon. So you have to wonder, if they're faking being halfway to the moon, it means they can't go halfway. It means they cannot leave Earth orbit. And what a surprise, 50 years later, we can still not leave Earth orbit. So how could we possibly leave Earth orbit with equipment that was 50 years older than what we have today, which can still not leave Earth orbit? There are bases at the South Pole. The South Pole has temperatures minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 100-mile-per-hour winds. And guess what? There are bases there. You know why? Because it's humanly possible. If it were so easy to go to the moon with 1960s technology on the first attempt, they would have been on Mars 10 years later, and they'd be in another solar system by now, and there would be numerous bases on the moon. There are no bases on the moon simply because it cannot be done. If it could be done, just like the South Pole, they would be there. And as you know from Astronauts Gone Wild, when I showed Edgar Mitchell this footage and he got very angry, physically assaulted me, threatened to shoot me, in the commotion, we, left a wireless microphone on him of very high quality. And my cameraman put the camera in the back of the rental car, and it was still recording the private audio in the guy's house. And guess what? They're talking about calling the CIA to have me assassinated. If they really went to the moon, and I'm some silly person who thinks otherwise, I don't think they would have to call the CIA to have me assassinated. Do you? The reason they would is because I'm exposing a real crime of the federal government. People don't realize how easy it is. Some people say, well, I believe they went to the moon because I saw it on television. No independent press coverage. They didn't even show live, television images during the landing. It said simulation, on the TV screen. They showed a fuzzy black and white picture, and that's their claim that they went to the moon. All that they have is the testimony of government lying employees and alleged moon rocks. And when in fact one was examined, it turned out to be a piece of petrified wood. Yet no one asks the question, if the rocks are fake, what about the moon missions? And of course, that's because the media is run by the criminals who faked it, and they don't want to expose it.
So one thing I like about the book, Moon Man, is that you wrote the book kind of interactively. So in the book, there are links to YouTube videos where you're prompted, okay, go ahead and go watch this link now. Go ahead and go watch that link now. And so back to the discussion we were having about them having the CIA, like they made a joke about the CIA waxing you, and then you made kind of, I'll call it a spoof video, retort to this where, I don't know, I guess you're just gonna have to watch the video. It's pretty funny. Not Gone Wild videos. In a court of law, if I was a judge, I would say, well, this is circumstantial evidence because just because astronauts are getting angry or whatever, how many times has somebody stuck a camera in their face and said, you didn't land on the moon, and you get to a point 50 years later where you want to punch somebody, which is completely uncalled for. But I could say, well, that still doesn't necessarily prove.
Oh, I agree. I'm not claiming.
No, I know you. I know that. I know.
I'm not claiming that Astronauts Gone Wild proves that we didn't go to the moon. The only thing in there that I could say potentially proves that they didn't go to the moon is an Apollo astronaut threatening to have me assassinated by the CIA, which I don't see why they would do if they really went, and I'm just silly and believe otherwise.
No.
So I think that's proof. Let me ask you this. You've seen a funny thing happened on the way to the moon.
Yeah. You've
seen the classified footage of fake photography with the CIA prompting. You agree they're faking being halfway to the moon in that footage, right?
Oh, for sure. And this is the point that I was.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you agree that Apollo 11 is faking part of the photography of their mission, right?
100%.
Okay. Well, then why would they do that if they really went to the moon? Which means we do have proof. We do have proof. 4 out of 5 people who previously thought that the moon missions were real, when they watch a funny thing happen on the way to the moon, the window shot convinces them.
Yeah.
It convinced me.
But,
I mean, I describe in my book my horror when I found this classified footage, and it's like, it broke my heart. I'm thinking, is the world this wicked? Is the world this corrupt? Are they really that, arrogant? And, and they are. The fact is, even though the moon landing fraud probably killed the fewest number of people of many, disastrous government frauds, it would be the most embarrassing for the federal government if it came out. I mean, if one of the astronauts confessed on national TV it was a fake, it would break people's hearts, and then they will go, well, what else are they lying about? So it's the one thing that some even alleged conspiracy theorists, if that's what they really are, or alternative media people, refuse to talk about because maybe they're not who they appear. And so this is the one thing the government is most concerned about. And as you know, from chapter, I think it is 11 in the book, the Apollo 1 fire from the dead man's own family and hundreds of hours of investigation, they absolutely are certain that that fire was set deliberately. So when and if the truth comes out that the moon landings are indeed falsified, the very next thing they're going to investigate is the Apollo 1 fire, where the CIA deliberately murdered the crew that would have been the first crew to walk on the moon because they wouldn't cooperate with the fraud.
If the astronaut really was taken out of the equation because he was speaking publicly about this, in not just his life, but all the other lives, the amount of tax money that was taken from the American public, which it's like, well, they got us. But the question is what did they do with that tax money? What other kind of wars or what else could they have funded, that could have happened? And when you start looking at all these things, this is way more than just we faked the moon landing. This crumbles the entire system by which we live. Like every belief that you have about the United States government would suddenly just topple over if an astronaut was to come out on public television and say something like that. And I don't think people would realize that. And I wouldn't even have realized that. I'd be like, oh, well, they didn't land on the moon. And then what, you go about your life at that point in time. But no, when you start looking at the implications of everything that was involved with this, it's like that runs deep, real deep.
Well, I see exactly what you're saying. The thing is, I don't think people really are going, oh, well, they faked 9/11. Oh, well, they killed Kennedy. Oh, well, they faked, a news broadcast. I don't think that's the case because the people who run the news is the CIA, and they're not using the media, as Kennedy said it was the purpose of, was to keep the government in check. So they're making it appear like no one cares about all this fraud, just like they made it appear that people were walking on the moon when they weren't. The fact is, the people who run the media are the same ones who faked the moon landing, faked 9/11, killed Kennedy. It's entirely run by the CIA. Carl Bernstein, who broke Watergate, found a document in the 1970s. In the 1970s, it said there were 400 journalists working for the CIA. They worked for ABC, NBC, CBS, Time Magazine, Associated Press. They worked for everybody. And that was when there was regulation in place that says, you can only own 2 TV stations. Now that has been deregulated. Now propaganda is legally allowed, even though faking of the moon landing violated numerous laws, including one that says you cannot use television to deceive people, which came about because of the quiz show scandal. And these people are running the show. People do care, but they make it appear, because they run the media, that people don't care. I mean, they could have 99% of the public against something, but what they would do is they would interview 10 people of the 1% and make it look like, no, everyone's, for this event that people are really against. They can do anything that they want. I was watching every episode of Mary Tyler Moore last year because unfortunately Ed Asner, who just passed away, was about to star in my first feature film. God bless him. Nevertheless, I saw this episode that he was in where they had a snowstorm, okay, and their film crew was stuck in traffic in the snowstorm, and they couldn't get the traffic jam footage in time for the news. So one guy said, well, why don't we just use the traffic jam footage from last year? And Azur's like, you can't do that. We'll lose our FCC license for that little thing they're concerned about. And yet when CNN fakes being in Iraq when they're in Atlanta, nobody is penalized. I mean, it's just amazing. Imagine if you had 3,000 aerospace engineers saying that the moon landings were fake. I mean, imagine that. They don't say that because going to the moon is their God. But in any case, you have 3,000 people, professionals, risking their reputation, saying 9/11, those buildings did not come down by airplanes, especially the third one that half the public don't even know about. And yet nothing is done about it. I mean, these people, and you're right, I just recorded the audiobook of the book that you read. I just finished it yesterday. And as I'm reading my own book, I'm like, boy, do I let the U.S. government have it.
Man, I'm honestly, Bart, I'm not lying when I'm reading your book. Like as I was reading your book and I was thinking about us doing this podcast, I'm kind of like looking over my shoulder here, like, man, do I have some CIA agents like standing outside my door or something like that? You actually propose a theory in your book that during the whole 9/11 situation and when the plane crashed into the Pentagon, that the $2.3 trillion that came up missing at that time was possibly used to purchase all these communication and media companies.
Oh, yeah, they did that a long time ago. I mean, CNN sold, I believe, for $7 billion, which is one half the cost of one aircraft carrier. The government, the CIA has been using, fake fronts for a long time. I mean, it's not a secret that the Defense Authorization Research Project Agency, DARPA, that develops secretive technology, they founded Google. They founded it. It's an open admission. They own YouTube. I mean, that's why if you say anything against the current event, the Kennedy assassination, they could care less about, or 9/11 or the moon landing, but they want everybody to get this medical procedure. And if you say anything, because that's a current event, they want to control what people think because it controls their actions. A third of the book is about, here's how and why the moon landings are fake. A third is about my espionage adventures that I've never talked about publicly.
Yeah, which we haven't even gotten into yet.
Yeah. And then a third, and, I'm reading it out loud, is, just rebuking the federal government and governments in general. And it's unbelievable how deeply they are entrenched. They control everything. You're right. They bought up Facebook. They bought up YouTube. They bought up Google. I believe they bought up AT&T and all these things. When you click on, I want Yahoo email or whatever, it says you agree to the terms of service. And if you don't, you can't have it. And what are the terms of service? The right to scan your correspondence, which is to read them. Because they own the hardware, they believe they have the right to inspect it, which is to eavesdrop. They're basically criminals who write laws to make their crimes legal.
Look up, if you will, the unethical human experimentation in the United States. Look at that. It's a Wikipedia page. Look that Wikipedia page up and look at some of these unethical experiments that were going on. When you talk about corruption and people would never do that. I'll choose one right here. Operation Green Run in 1948, operation called the Green Run. The U.S. Atomic Engineering Commission (AEC) released iodine-131 and xenon-133 into the atmosphere near Hartford site in Washington, which contaminated 500,000 acre, 202,000 square kilometers area containing 3 small towns. Now, they did this knowing, obviously this was unethical. They knew what was going on. They knew that this was going to be harmful to people, and they did it anyway. And we live in this world where these kinds of things happen.
Well, if you believe in God, let me refresh everyone's memory of a particular scripture. When Jesus was being tempted by the devil after 40 days of fasting, The devil said that if Jesus bowed down to him, he would give him all the kingdoms of the world because they belong to the devil and he can give them to anyone he wants. So the devil runs the world at the moment. Can't you tell? Child molestation, homicide, genocide. Okay. So do you think the devil's going to give the kingdoms of the world to good people or to evil people? So it's a fact that evil people run the world. That's just the way that it is. Vanderbilt University deliberately put radioactive particles in pregnant women's food to see if the babies would be deformed, and they were deformed. They did it openly, and they admit that they did it. Vanderbilt University is still around. The Church of Rome admits. John Paul II, he said, "Oh yeah, by the way, the Catholic Church did kill 50 to 100 million people over the course of about 700 years for either owning a Bible or keeping the Saturday Sabbath. Yes, we're sorry, but they're still around." Can you imagine someone saying, "Oh yeah, by the way, this person molested, thousands of children, and they're still a babysitter"? Can you imagine that? That's what we have going on now. The people, CNN is still in business. They're bought up and run. It's not a coincidence that that the CIA's philosophy and CNN's philosophy are exactly the same. In fact, I point out in my book, some independent journalistic agency did a survey of, get this, 1,500 newspapers, TV stations, and whatever. And they were all 100% for the CIA overthrowing the democratically elected government of Venezuela. Now, how is that even possible? That every single news outlet, is pro CIA overthrowing a democracy, unless the CIA owns and runs those newspapers and TV stations, which they do. I mean, they run the show. It's amazing. And I worked in news for 2 years. The people do what they're told. They read what they're told to read. If they don't, they're fired. And they are prestigious jobs and they pay well and they're going to do what they're told. That's just the way that it is.
Let's go back to the actual landing itself. Let's talk about some of the hard evidence. We talked about the video, how they're shooting inside of the capsule. Talk about the photo with the shadows. Talk about the spacesuit. Let's talk about the Van Allen radiation belt as well.
So here's a picture I took about a half a mile away during sunlight. Okay. The sun is about 1 million times bigger in volume than the Earth, and it's about 93 million miles away. So when it casts shadows, it's going to cast shadows in the same direction over an entire continent and over the moon in the same direction. So natural sunlight produces parallel shadows. They will never, ever intersect. All you got to do is go outside on a clear day, have you and your friends stand about 5 feet apart from one another, and you'll see that your shadows never intersect. Here's a picture allegedly taken on the moon. Here's an astronaut shadow, and here's a shadow from a rock about 5 feet away, and they're intersecting at almost 90 degrees. This is impossible for this to take place in sunlight. This can only take place with electrical light. This is the only proof you need to prove that the moon landings are fake. So here's an astronaut shadow. Here's a shadow of a rock. They're going at 90 degrees when, if they were in sunlight, like they claimed, in fact, the moon has no atmosphere. So it's supposed to be 20 times brighter than on Earth. So the last thing you would need would be an electrical light. But I'm a filmmaker. My job is to make fake scenes look real. I use electrical lights all the time to simulate sunlight, sunrises, sunsets, things like that. So I can tell you with 100% certainty, this photograph was taken with electrical light. That's why the shadows intersect. The only proof that you need that the moon landings are fake is this one picture, because it is simply impossible for shadows from objects 5 feet apart from one another to intersect at 90 degrees in sunlight, which means it was not taken in sunlight, which means it was taken with electrical light, which means it's on the Earth and not the moon.
If this was taken with electrical light, I mean, obviously, because you do production, then there had to be two light sources for this. Because
There could be two. There could be two, or sometimes it's one light source, but it's small and close. So if you're standing on the left side of the light, it would cast a shadow one direction. If you're standing or this rock is on the right side of the light, then it could cast it in a different direction. In any case, it's not sunlight. Therefore, it's not on the moon. Pretty crystal clear.
in one of the Moon Man videos that was linked to the book, NASA did a demonstration with that, and instead of using the sun, they actually decided to do it at night with an artificial light.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty funny. When the National Geographic did a special trying to prove my, moon film wrong. And they went out into a desert at night. In fact, I could show you a clip of that if you want to see it. They went out to a desert at night. So basically, they went out to a desert at night and they used one big spotlight and put an actor in an astronaut suit and basically said, hey, look, the shadows do intersect. Therefore, my, argumentation is wrong. Well, in fact, they actually proved me right because they're simulating the Apollo pictures with an electrical light. And they say, look, they intersected almost 90 degrees. Therefore, the point in my film is wrong. They're actually proving me right because they prove that the shadows intersect with an electrical light. So they matched the Apollo pictures with an electrical light, which means the Apollo pictures were taken with an electrical light. I mean, all they had to do.
Why wouldn't NASA have replicated this in the day when there was actual sun?
Well, yeah, all they had to do is go to the same desert 12 hours earlier and do it in sunlight. If they really wanted to simulate the sunlit conditions on the moon, they would have just gone to the desert during the day, and they would have seen quite clearly that the shadows would be parallel, just like in this picture, right? They would have been parallel and they would have never intersected. So what they did is they went to a desert at night and they simulated allegedly the surface of the moon with an electrical light and the shadows intersected. And yet they said, this proves me wrong when it's the very thing that proves me right. That the reason why the shadows intersect in their demonstration is because it was taken with an electrical light, which means the Apollo pictures were also taken with electrical light. They said they couldn't simulate the sun, but they could. All they had to do is go to the same desert 12 hours earlier in sunlight and have their astronauts stand there, and the shadows would have never intersected. So it's amazing. They were trying to prove me wrong, and yet they actually proved me right. And yet they deceived the audience and said the very evidence that proves me right proves me wrong. I mean, it's remarkable, the deception. So Neil Armstrong in this image, the part that was shown to the public, just said that he's 130,000 miles away from the Earth. And it certainly looks like that because this is allegedly the blackest space and this is allegedly the Earth. They even put a little piece of crescent material into the window. But here in this footage, the outtakes, you can actually see, it's the same proportion, it's the same Earth, when in fact it's a 1 foot model using the window as a rear projection for a transparency of the Earth, right? Over here is 130,000 miles out. And over here is where you see it's really the window. And it's a 1 foot model of the Earth. This is absolute proof that the crew of Apollo 11 is faking being halfway to the moon. So then you have to ask yourself, if they're faking being halfway to the moon, it means they couldn't go halfway, which means they cannot leave Earth orbit. Which, what a surprise, 50 years later, with 50 years better technology, they still cannot leave Earth orbit.
I want to circle back to your book because in the book, what you have in the book is a source that you have waited until your source passed away in order to reveal some information in the latter parts of the book that gave 15 names. I'm obviously not going to spoil that for any of the listeners here. If you want that information, you can go to the book and check it out. But can you just set up the context of all this for the readers to pique their interest, so to speak?
Yeah, basically there are two major things that are discussed in the book that I've never discussed publicly, one of which is many more espionage, CIA misadventures than just having the threat. At one time, I was kidnapped. I was drugged. I escaped. They gave me some sort of truth serum, interrogated me. I urinated in a cup, had a friend bring that urine specimen to a lab. When we called the lab to get the report, they told us there was a break in over the weekend, and the only thing stolen was my urine sample. There's a lot of crazy things like that going on. And the main thing is that I have a source who was actually there at the military base where Apollo 11 was filmed in June of 1968. I disclose in the book the official code name for the real Apollo project, as well as the name of the military base and 15 names because this person was chief of security. And he was given this list of names and said only these people are allowed to enter to witness the faking of the moon landing. President Johnson is on that list and 14 other people, some of whom are still alive today. This person was chief of security at this particular base. He confessed this on his deathbed. Now, he justified, to himself that, well, they must have had a really good reason why they did this. However, it really brought him to tears when he saw a year later on TV this shot that was claiming to be on the moon, when in fact it was at his military base filmed a year earlier. So this confession is, gone into detail in the book. And so now we know. We know where Apollo 11 was filmed. We know the code name for the project, and we have a list of 15 people who were there at the time. Now, I was verifying all of this details about a year ago with my source and a relative of the deceased person. And shortly after doing that, my source's, relative, his house was broken into. And everything about his relative who was there at the time, all that was stolen and nothing else. Then 2 days after that, another two government visitors actually met him in person, and said that if he talked to me ever again, they would kill him and his family. Subsequently, I called the White House. I talked to the press secretary. I talked to a United States senator on the Intelligence Committee and to the FBI to, protect this person from these rogue elements of the CIA. All this is in the book Moon Man. Like I said, about a third of it is why and how we didn't go to the moon. A third is these crazy, behind the scenes adventures that I had, including naming the base where it was filmed, the code name, and the list of 15 people who were there, some of whom are alive. And then, like you said, it's a general indictment of the federal government and governments in general, because, this, despicable despotism that's controlling our government is pretty much controlling almost every government of the world. It's being supervised by people at the top who have their agenda, which is to get rid of 93% of the people of the world. That they openly said so.
When I read this book, was it kind of, people often think like, oh, the JFK assassination, that's a conspiracy theory. The moon landings, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. Oh, the with this pandemic you're talking about, that's a conspiracy theory. But your book kind of establishes I don't know if motive is the right word, but how this is it's just corruption at the highest levels and how all these things are interconnected in essence.
And that's what I realized when I put in the secret tape and I saw them faking part of the mission right in front of my eyes with the CIA telling them how to do it. It just broke my heart that this is the world that we live in, but it is the world that we live in. Corrupt people run the world. 75% of Americans agree that Oswald did not kill Kennedy. And they said, I don't know, in the 90s that they were going to release the Kennedy assassination files in 2017. But if you read the actual law, it says we will release them in 2017 unless the current president at that time decides not to. What's the point of even writing a law like that anyway? And they must have had something on Trump, because, if he can't even release something that happened 50 years ago because it will bring down the government, then those people are threatening him, blackmailing him, or whatever's going on. The fact is, I showed this footage of fake photography to an NBC news director. They turned pale white. They collapsed in their chair. They put their hand over their mouth and said, "Oh my God, this absolutely proves they didn't go to the moon." And I said, "Yeah, what do we do about it?" He thought for a moment and then he said, "I cannot air this. It will cause a civil war. I do not want to be responsible for that." 10, 20 years later, another NBC producer agreed equally. They said, "This tape proves they didn't go to the moon. We're going to air it nationwide." They were contacted by government officials and told not to do it. Why? Because it would bring down the system. Well, that's a good thing. If the truth about corruption brings down a corrupt government, then the truth is doing its job. And that's why they ridicule people who are exposing their crimes. The fact is, half of all crimes are conspiracies. Half are done in the heat and the emotion of the moment without planning, and half are planned in advance. They're conspiracies. That's what the word means. It's in the Bible multiple times. People were conspiring to kill kings throughout the Bible. And believe me, wicked people run the world. And in order to do that, they have plans. You can call that conspiracy or whatever. It's simply uncovering crimes. And so the problem is that these criminals run the news media. They own it all. They own telecommunication. They own, social media. And that's why there's so much censorship, right? So there you go.
Well, listen, if you want to hear more about Bart's tales of espionage and more evidence on the moon landing hoax, moon landing fraud, in his condemnation of the government and how these things can interconnect, check out his book, Moon Man. Bart, where can they get the book, Moon Man?
If you go to Sibrel.com, Sibrel.com, you'll have a link for the print version, for the Kindle version, and the audiobook version, all available immediately.
All right, final question for the day, Bart. Other than Buzz Aldrin, have you ever been punched in the face by anybody else? I'm asking you this because I got punched in the face. It was part of my job hazard.
Maybe my sister when I was 12. Well, I think that's about it.
Okay, well, maybe on one occasion you deserved it, and on the other you did not. But
I'm sure. Well, most of the time, I'm sure I deserve it. But and I since apologized to Buzz Aldrin. I'm doing my best to be a Christian, but it's a learning experience. Yeah. I'm in school. I go to the principal's office about once a year for doing something wrong, and the Bible says not to rebuke an older man harshly. That's what I did. And I apologized. I shouldn't have spoke to him in that harsh manner. I do believe what I said. At the same time, I need to have compassion on him as well. And he immediately bought a copy of the film, the day I apologized. I'm doing my best, and even asking people to swear on the Bible. Someone showed me that the Bible says not to take an oath. I wasn't aware of that at the time. And so if I were to do it again, I probably wouldn't even make Astronauts Gone Wild. However, as some of the followers of this, story have indicated, it's a good historical record to see how these people reacted. They were given the opportunity to come clean, but they refused to do it. It's pretty sad state when the heroes of our country are actually traitors. But that's what we have. And we have a news media that, unless they're reporting about the weather, they pretty much say the exact opposite of the truth all the time.
I'll say this as a fellow Christian: if you're only in the principal's office once a year, you're doing okay. Because I think I'm in there on a weekly basis. So, Bart, thanks for coming on, man. I appreciate it so much.
Sure, Rich. You take care.